I am Flavia Bellieni Zimmermann from the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Professor Samina Yasmeen. Professor Samina Yasmeen, she is a fellow for the Australian Institute of International Affairs, a recipient of the Order of Australia, and she's the director of the Centre for Muslim States and Societies at the University of Western Australia. Today, we are going to be discussing Islamophobia in the light of the Christchurch attacks. Thank you for being with us, Professor Yasmeen.
Pleasure.
Professor Yasmeen, if you could please explain to us if Islamophobia is a problem today in Australia and around the world.
Well, Islamophobia is definitely a problem, not just simply for Australia, but for the world. And often we look at it in terms of a problem experienced in the Western societies or Western liberal societies. But what I would argue is that from the 1990s onwards, its presence has been recognized, for example, in Britain by Runnymede Trust. And after that, as the world has become more globalized and this Cold War came to an end, people started moving, the migration increased. The tendency for people to identify Muslims as the other has increased. And 9/11 definitely contributed to that, because the fact that 3,000 people were killed as a result of activities of Muslim militants who thought they were engaged in jihad created this image that Muslims all over the world are the other. They're different from us and they're not peace-loving. They're violent, they're illogical, and they do not want to really engage with the West. So they, in lots of ways, they reaffirmed the variables that Runnymede Trust has identified as being at the heart of Islamophobia. But where I think post 9/11 world has increased Islamophobia is the fact that with the increased technology and people being able to talk to each other, engage with each other, share ideas, international connections have been built which constantly feed Islamophobia, and it also constantly refines the terms on which Islamophobia is discussed, presented, and then acted upon. And so it's definitely an issue. In Australia, you can see that it's become more of an issue. For example, after 2001, there were people who started talking about Islam being the problem. But still there was an idea that not all Muslims are bad. And so that's very impressive in Australian context. Even though we participated in the global war on terror, the fact that there were people who said you can't blame the whole Muslim community showed that there was a sense of discerning between the militants and the non-militant Muslims. But that changed very soon after 2005, when the London bombing happened. Because of our close identification with Britain, there was a tendency to see Muslims in a more negative light than was the case before. And it's continued to increase, especially after the ISIS came up. But what I've noticed since 2001, but definitely 2005 onwards, that the number of people who have come from overseas, who have communicated ideas and they've been picked up in Australia, has increased. So while in 2008, when I was presenting a paper in Melbourne, I thought it was creeping Islamophobia. Now it's very visible Islamophobia. But I think still we need to be careful that we shouldn't think of it as being all-pervasive Islamophobia. Still within Australia, and I'd say even around the world, and there is a realization among a number of people that Muslim identification as the problem or as the other is invalid. But I'm looking at the half-full glass. The other side of the glass is that there are people who are convinced, for whatever reason, drawing upon their personal experiences, information that they come across, or what they've been told, that Muslims are the problem.
Thank you very much. And Professor Yasmeen, if you could please explain to us the link between Islamophobia in the Christchurch attacks?
I think what happened in Christchurch really reflects how this continued focus on Muslims as the other and the global linkages that people develop while they're discussing it, either in person or online, how that has created a group of people who are really around the world who feel that it's their responsibility and their right to do the right thing and remove the threat. And because they identify Muslims as the threat, they feel justified. So Islamophobia, I would say, has directly contributed to what happened in Christchurch. The fact that the person who engaged in that massacre in 2 mosques, he started his whole online sort of depiction of what he was going to do with songs that were Serbian, building upon the conflict between the Serbs and the Bosnian Muslims, and then how all the messages that he wrote on his rifles that he used. I think what it tells us is that he had picked up all these ideas from different parts of the world, not all non-Muslim by the way, but different parts of the world, that got him into a space where he thought he was cleansing the world of Muslims, and that was the start. And I think in that sense, sadly, it's reminiscent of what happened to the Jews. Because once you start thinking of cleansing the world of a certain community, you feel justified. Now, luckily, we do not have a government, or we do not have governments that actually subscribe to that ideology. But the fact that people in today's world are very few who think that they can do that actually tells me that Christchurch reflects that increasing Islamophobia around the world. It doesn't necessarily reflect Australian phenomena, it reflects a global phenomena of Islamophobia, where the sad thing, I think, becomes significant for us in Australia is that the person happened to be an Australian. And while all these years I have held the view, and I still believe in that Australia is a very good example of a multicultural society, the sad fact is that one attack, or 2 attacks in fact, they have shown us that there is a small minority that is bent upon really tearing apart the fabric of our society. In the process, what they think they're doing is really making it better. So, short answer, yes, definitely they were linked, but I wouldn't want to exclude a whole lot of other factors that we haven't really come across, and I think we could find explanations for that, but I don't know.
Thank you so much. And Professor Yasmeen, if you could please explain if the attacks could have been prevented.
That's a big question, because it's the same question that people asked after 9/11. And as I say, what happened in Christchurch is Muslims' 9/11. 9/11 happened and everybody said there were those so-called jihadis who really maligned the word jihad. Could we have known about them? Could we have stopped them? Could these attacks have been prevented? There was a whole process of looking at how these people managed to come into America, how they managed to share information. So it's the same sort of a question that we're asking now and saying, could that have been prevented? I think how a very small minority can suddenly take over the whole situation and draw attention to extreme negativity has already been established with the first 9/11. But in this case, could that have been prevented? I think one thing that could have helped is a more focus on the ultra right-wing nationalism that has emerged around the world and that has had its presence in Australia. Like others, what I said, I've got this confidence that Australia is a very strong multicultural society. Like a whole lot of us, I think maybe the state structures also didn't really fully appreciate the danger that this right-wing nationalism plays in resulting in these attacks. So one way of looking at this whole thing is that yes, they could have been prevented if the focus was not just simply on countering Muslim radicalization. Because most of the efforts that have been sort of directed in this space have been with the subtext of how do we counter violent extremism among Muslims. Had there been greater focus or equal focus even on the right-wing nationalists, those who quite proudly in lots of ways have been inviting speakers from overseas, from Holland, from America, Britain and elsewhere, if we had said that, look, letting that language develop within Australia could corrupt the minds of some people. Had we done that, and I think had law enforcement agencies focused more on that, probably we could have had a different outcome. And again, it's the same thing. New Zealand and others, they weren't aware of this. So maybe if the New Zealand government also had more inkling of how strong these groups were, that could have been avoided. So I guess it's a way of looking at it which says that can we prevent that? And as I said, after 9/11, we can't say attacks like this can be prevented necessarily. But if you look at the basic causes and say why that's happened, and if you start addressing them, and if you have good law enforcement procedures, then I think you have a better way of controlling it. In this case, maybe that could have done something.
Thank you very much. And your views on Queensland Senator Fraser Anning's remarks on the attacks?
I think he needs more sensitivity, clarity, and stop playing with people's lives. It's horrific. It's disgusting. That's the only word that I can think of. For someone to try and make mileage out of massacre of people in a way that's really been etched into memories of all those who saw those online videos and say it's actually because of immigration. I think that really shows the depth to which someone can go for political gains. Now, he might come back and say that wasn't the reason, he was just stating a fact. But I think, I'm not speaking as a Muslim, I'm speaking as someone who has worked on Islamophobia and how these ideas get promoted, and how even sometimes Muslims can misperceive the level of Islamophobia. From that perspective, I think he's done a lot of harm to Australia because he's drawn attention to the fact that some of our politicians, not all, they would not give up any chance of making good of any extremely negative, sad situations. I think he's actually drawn attention to the darkness among those people. And so the other way of looking at it is that he's given Australia a bad name. I look at different media and I see how any situation as it's developing, how it's seen by different countries. So just to give you a contrast, in case of Pakistani media, even the Prime Minister, Imran Khan, he has praised New Zealand Prime Minister for the way she dealt with the issue. And then Pakistani media is replete with comments on what Fraser Anning stands for. I think he has given Australia a bad name because first we have that person who has an Australian origin who engages in that massacre. Then we've got a senator who, instead of saying he can feel the pain, comes up and says it's because of immigration. So he's really he's shone light on that darkness that we have. But I think then looking at it in a different way, I'm glad he said that. I'm glad because it actually draws attention to, again, what I'm saying is minority, increasing minority, but a minority that looks at Muslims as a problem and that looks at immigration as a problem. And I think it makes everyone sit up and say, how do we deal with this? And so the more we let our criticism be heard, the more we add to the voice of people who say these views are not acceptable in Australia. In fact, these views are not acceptable in today's world. And I think it also then draws attention to one thing, that when these events happen, no matter where they are, and which religious community gets targeted because of this religious fanaticism or irreligious fanaticism, it is the responsibility of people to stand up and say this is unacceptable. So I would have expected him to keep quiet, but the fact that he didn't keep quiet, I think I'm glad he didn't keep quiet, because now we can say he's the face of this negativity. But there are other faces as well. And those faces have been very vocal in the past, including our former Prime Minister. So let's not forget that. But the other bit I want to also add to is that right now, because the shock is so great, we all can say, gee, that's not good, that's uncalled for. But what's needed is to continue this rage or this disapproval or criticism of such policies beyond this point. Because we have a strange way of, or human beings have a strange way of forgetting trauma. For example, I think of the attack in the Army Public School in 2014 in Pakistan. I remember the rage in the whole of Pakistan and even elsewhere, saying, how could that happen? And what I wrote then, and I still think that holds true now, is that we hope we get to some point and these mothers don't lose their children for no reason. So now when I look at Pakistan, sometimes I feel sad and I think probably those kids did lose their lives for no reason. I don't want the same thing to happen to Australia or to New Zealand or to elsewhere. So it's important that we continue to hold on to these views and build that international and national connections that voice one opinion, that we have to be together as human beings. And that responsibility is not just for the wider community, it's equally with the Muslim community.
Thank you very much, Professor Yasmeen. Pleasure talking to you.
Pleasure.
Thank you for being with us. And for more information, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au.